Tonight, you're not scrolling or counting tomorrow's chores. You're sitting at the edge of an Asgard kitchen table moment, close enough to hear wood settle, close enough to notice how a single apple can make even gods behave like people. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch how Idunn's power isn't a weapon at all, but a habit carried in a plain basket. You'll feel the first quiet panic of immortals realizing youth is not a permanent setting, just a routine that can be interrupted. And you'll well see how the smallest missing thing can turn a whole pantheon into a room full of anxious, aging faces. Without a single battle starting, 3 small senses to keep you company, a wooden door creaks and then decides to be polite. An apple rolls once on a table and stops as if it has been told to. And wind needles the shutters like a thin, impatient thread. Something nearby keeps time, a slow, obedient creak in the hinge, repeating whenever the draft remembers it exists. If your breathing starts to follow that rhythm, perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing only if you enjoy this kind of quiet history and myth. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little apple roll will remember you there the next time it decides to move. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with thunder, or a prophecy, or a sword raised to the sky. It begins with a basket that doesn't look like power, and a fruit so ordinary it can sit on a table until the day the gods start to feel their years. You might not think that the gods of Norse mythology could be undone by something as small and ordinary as fruit, but their entire sense of immortality sits in a simple basket that could in theory fit on the corner of a kitchen table. Not a glowing relic, not a pillar of flame, just apples, piled together with the quiet confidence of things that know they are needed. Somewhere in Asgard, a wooden door sighs as it opens, a floorboard remembers every footstep it has ever held, and an apple rolls a little too far on a table. Before coming to rest as if it is testing gravity in slow motion, Idunn, who keeps the apples, does not look like a god of thunder or a queen of battle. In your mind, you can see her as someone who belongs naturally beside shelves, windows, and baskets. She moves the way a person moves when they are used to carrying things that bruise easily. Her power is not in a roar, it is in a routine. She checks the apples. She turns them so the same side is not always resting down. She makes sure the basket sits where the light is kind and the air is cool. The apples themselves are not jeweled or carved. They could almost be mistaken for ordinary fruit from an ordinary orchard if you ignore the way the gods look at them with the patient hunger of people who know what happens if the supply runs out. Immortality here is not a switch that was flipped once. It is more like a subscription that has to be renewed by eating regularly, which is one of the gentlest cosmological systems you could imagine. The gods visit Idunn the way people visit a kitchen between tasks, not all at once, and not with ceremony. One stops by after a council, another after a hunt, another after a small disagreement that left them feeling older than they enjoy. They take an apple, or a slice, or a bite, and they chew without fanfare. It's almost comical how something that important happens with such little performance. No speeches, no trumpet, just the sound of teeth and the small pause that comes when the first sweetness hits the tongue. You can imagine Thor, who is normally associated with thunder, leaning against the doorframe and eating an apple with the same concentration someone might give to a sandwich between meetings. Loki, of course, eats as if he is tasting the idea of trouble in the flavor, just to see if it's there. Odin eats slowly, as if he is memorizing the taste in case it ever disappears. The apples do not glow as they work, but the gods stand a little straighter afterward. Their joints forget to complain, and their reflections in polished metal stay obediently youthful. Because the gods are used to this arrangement, they do not think of themselves as dependent on it, any more than you think of yourself as dependent on brushing your teeth or drinking water. It is simply something done. A priest of routine, Idunn carries her basket from one place to another, and Asgard remains in that strange state of never quite changing. Time walks past the walls, but it does not come in. Or at least that is what everyone believes, until the first morning when someone wakes up and feels a stiffness that should not be there. It is a small stiffness at first, an almost polite ache behind the knees, the kind that could be explained away by strange dreams, or an unfamiliar bed, or the wrong pillow. But then another god notices a heavy feeling in the chest after laughter, a slightly slower recovery after a stretch. They laugh it off because laughter is trained to arrive first, but the thought has already formed. That was not there before. Once you notice time, time notices you back. It is subtle. No dramatic wrinkles, no instant shock, just micro changes. A smile line that lingers a little longer, a gesture that feels heavier than it should. Someone glances toward Idunn's basket, expecting reassurance, and for a moment they cannot remember whether they ate an apple yesterday or the day before, and it bothers them in a way that gets under the armor and sits there. You understand this feeling if you have ever checked whether you locked the door and then had to check again. The gods start to check Idunn, not because they doubt her, but because they need the comfort of seeing the basket exactly where it should be, with the apples resting like patient sons. Loki, meanwhile, is the sort of figure who moves between places the way smoke moves between beams. He is never fully contained by any single room or rule. It makes him interesting at parties and exhausting at meetings. One quiet day, when the air beyond Asgard's walls feels a little thinner, Loki wanders out as he often does, slipping through boundaries that were meant to be symbolic and treating them like polite suggestions. Outside the walls, the world is larger, colder, and less impressed by divine job titles. Giants live out there, and strange beings, and the kind of bargains that are written in invisible ink. Loki is approached with one of those bargains. It does not start with menace. It starts with a comparison. Somewhere beyond the forest, there might be apples even better than Idunn's, rarer fruit that could be tasted, tested, weighed against the familiar flavor. The promise is light as frost. It sounds harmless, more like a culinary suggestion than a cosmic threat. Loki, being Loki, is attracted to the idea, not because he wishes anyone harm, at least not in this sleepy version of the story, but because he cannot resist the possibility of better. Better is his favorite word, and also his biggest problem. He brings the news back to Idunn the gentlest possible way. Perhaps he says, very casually, that he has seen trees with fruit that look a little different, and wouldn't it be interesting, purely for research, to compare them to her apples? He doesn't say, let's destroy the basis of immortality. He says, let's have a taste test. The lie is mild and covered in curiosity, like a pill buried in honey. It works because Idunn is not vain, but she is responsible. If there are other apples out there that could help the gods even more, shouldn't she know? So she steps outside the walls with her basket, the way someone might step out of the house with a recipe book to visit a new market. The air changes a little. The trees look taller. The light is thinner. You can imagine her pausing, feeling the handles of the basket warm against her palms, wondering briefly if this was necessary. But Loki is there, and Loki is confident, and confidence is a very persuasive costume. The further they walk, the quieter Asgard becomes behind them, like a house whose doors have been left slightly open. When the trap finally tightens and Idunn is taken up into the air by a giant in eagle shape, or simply away into someone else, as keeping the important thing for this sleepy telling is not the violence of the moment, but the quiet shock that follows. The basket is gone. The apples are gone. The place on the shelf where they sat has become a small, precise absence, like a missing tooth your tongue cannot stop touching. Back in Asgard, the change is not immediate thunder. It is the slow change of mornings. Someone wakes up with a neck that does not want to turn. Someone else climbs stairs that feel steeper than they remember. Laughter at breakfast arrives with a small cough afterward. The gods still look impressive, of course. This is myth. But there are signs. Helmets feel heavier. Belts need a new hole. A sword that used to be light enough to toss between hands becomes an object that prefers to be placed down carefully. The conversations shift too. Where they used to talk about feasts and adventures, they start talking about sleep and how they never quite feel caught up on it, which is probably the most realistic detail in the whole story. The domestic emergency grows like a rumor. Someone goes to see Idunn and finds only the empty space. The news travels, not as a scream, but as a repeated sentence. The apples are gone. It passes from room to room, from small cluster to small cluster, and each god hearing it feels a familiar tug in their joints, as if their bodies have been waiting for an excuse to age. They gather not for battle, but for a meeting. The atmosphere is less like a war council and more like a group of people discovering that the one person who knew all the passwords has misplaced the notebook. There's talking over one another. There's blaming. There's the particular tension of beings who are used to certainty discovering they now live with maybe. Every set of eyes eventually drifts toward Loki. Loki has the reputation that does half the work for the accusers. He is blamed the way the last hand on the door is blamed for the draft. He can feel the same dull drag at the edges of his own immortality now, a heaviness behind the jokes, like wet cloth. It is one thing to cause trouble that happens to other people. It is another thing to realize you have inconvenienced yourself as well. The gods, in their less dramatic, more sleep-friendly way, give him a simple ultimatum. Fix it, or live with a version of old age that will not be reversed. This is not shouted. It is said the way a tired person says, "Please put that back," after something important has been moved. Loki does not suddenly become noble, but he does become very motivated. Survival is not a grand virtue, but it is a reliable one. He agrees to retrieve Idunn and the apples, not out of an awakened conscience, but because he does not especially want to experience arthritis. For a god who likes quick gestures and sharp thoughts, the idea of slow hands and slower knees is a powerful argument. To solve the problem, he does what he always does. He turns into something else. In many versions of Norse myth, shape-shifting is handled with the same casual tone as changing clothes. Loki has access to borrowed forms, and one of the most useful is borrowed from Freya, who owns a cloak of falcon feathers. You can picture it hanging somewhere in her space, light and soft, smelling faintly of feathers and air. The cloak is the mythic equivalent of a travel app put it on, and suddenly distances become less of an issue. Loki asks for it in his own roundabout way. Perhaps he promises not to ruin it. Perhaps he doesn't, which is more likely. Freya, who understands that logistics matter, lets him have it anyway, because godly knees are starting to hurt. When Loki wraps himself in the falcon cloak, the transformation can be imagined not as a violent twist, but as a slightly brisk shiver. Bones rearrange, weight shifts, vision sharpens. The world becomes wider and flatter at the same time, the way it does when you look down from a height. Wings are simply arms with a more dramatic to-do list. He takes to the air, not like an arrow, but like a careful scout, tracing the old paths between worlds where smoke and whispers travel. Somewhere beyond the comfortable circle of Asgard, he finds Idunn, still with her apples, as if the universe understands that the apples are not negotiable. They are sitting in their basket like well-behaved school children, waiting for someone to take them back to class. The trick for Loki is not stealing them, exactly, but compressing the situation into something portable. In some tellings, he turns Idunn into a nut so he can carry her in his claws. It is a bizarre detail, but if you lean into it, it becomes gently funny. The goddess of youth reduced for a moment to something that could roll under furniture. It is mythic problem solving at its most practical. When in doubt, make important things smaller. Loki, with a nut that is also Idunn and a memory of a basket that will soon be filled again, flies home. There may be pursuit, there may be wind, but in this version, it's all background texture. like distant traffic you can ignore once the windows are closed. Back in Asgard, the return of the apples does not land as a triumphant finale. It feels more like groceries arriving at the exact moment everyone realized the cupboards were bare. The basket is set back in its familiar place. The apples glint softly, not with magic, but with the ordinary shine of polished skins. The gods gather around, and there is a small, almost embarrassed silence. The kind people have when they've just remembered how much they rely on something they usually take for granted. One by one, they eat. Chewing has never been so revered. Shoulders loosen. Faces seem less dragged down by invisible hands. Reflections in metal decide to be kind again. Immortality, or something very close to it, resumes not with fireworks, but with the quiet satisfaction of a system back online. The whole episode could have become a painful lesson, but in this sleepy retelling, it becomes more of a bedtime reminder. The gods learn that even their endless lives depend on small, repeatable acts, apples checked, baskets carried, routines honored. If they must renew themselves, then so, perhaps, do you. Not with golden fruit from a mythic orchard, but with your own small rituals, sleep, a glass of water, a stretch that you actually hold for more than 2 seconds, a meal eaten slowly enough to taste. These are not dramatic solutions. They are apple moments, tiny renewals that time respects. You can imagine, as the hall settles back into something like normal, that someone, maybe Idunn, maybe an anonymous voice offers a quiet oath to the room. Nothing grand, nothing shouted. Something like, we will try not to forget how quickly safety can vanish and how gently it can be restored if we pay attention. The words don't have to be carved into stone. They can sit unspoken in the way the gods now glance more often at the basket, in the way they thank Idunn with an extra nod, in the way Loki, for a short while, avoids making jokes about apples. Night moves over Asgard. Doors close with the same soft creaks they always had. The basket rests in its corner like a small, steadfast moon made of wood. The apples breathe their quiet promise into the air. Outside the walls, time still walks back and forth, but tonight it agrees to wait a little longer at the gate. Inside, the gods lie down feeling almost as young as they did before, and Idunn finally sets her basket down and lets her hands rest. Somewhere in that long, quiet stretch, your own thoughts can loosen in the same way, unwinding from worries and circling instead around the harmless idea that eternity, even for gods, is just a matter of well-kept habits repeated softly day after day, until the story of your life feels less like a race and more like a series of slow, steady bites from an apple that never quite runs out. You might not think an entire rainbow bridge would need a full-time listener, but in Norse mythology, there's a god whose main job is basically to stand by a very bright road and pay attention, not to charge down it, not to decorate it, just to notice things. His name is Heimdall, and if you picture him tonight, try not to imagine trumpets and flashing armor. Imagine instead someone who has been left in charge of a hallway for so long that he knows every single creak in the floor. If you're listening from your bed or from a blanket nest on the couch, you can tell me where you are and what time it is. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe or you can forget completely. Heimdall will not be offended. He is far too busy listening to other things, like the extremely slow sound of grass growing, which, according to the old stories, he can actually hear. Heimdall's post is the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge between the world of gods and the world of humans. You might expect a cosmic security checkpoint to be gloomy, but this one is all color and light, reaching down toward Midgard like someone spilled paint over the sky and forgot to clean it up. At one end of this bridge stands a hall called Himmelbjerg, Heaven's Cliffs, which sounds grand, but you can imagine it as surprisingly homey on the inside, with benches that have learned the shapes of tired warriors and hooks where helmets quietly steam after rain. Heimdall lives there, inside this bright threshold, and his life is made of details. He is said to have 9 mothers, which already tells you that his origin story was written by people who were not afraid of complicated family trees. He has teeth described as golden, which sounds luxurious until you remember how much work it would be to clean them. He can see for incredible distances and hear at impossible volumes. In some lines of myth, he can hear wool growing on sheep and grass pushing its way out of the earth, which means that for him, every meadow is basically an ongoing SMR channel. Because of all this, Heimdall sleeps very little, less than a bird, according to one quiet phrase in the sources. That doesn't mean he stands, wild-eyed and tense, staring into the dark. Think of it more as a series of very efficient naps. A blink just slightly longer than usual. A pause between breaths. He doesn't have the luxury of long dreams, so he collects small ones instead, like a person who learns to love catnaps on a busy train. You can imagine him leaning on his spear by the bridge, eyes half closed, and still somehow aware of everything. A leaf falls at the far edge of a forest. A door closes in a distant village. Someone in a boat drops an oar and mutters about it. All of these sounds arrive, and Heimdall quietly files them into his internal archive of things that are not an emergency. It must be a very large archive. The funny part is that for most of eternity, his job is mostly nothing happening. The legends say he will one day blow the Jallarhorn, his great horn, to announce a final, terrifying battle, but that is a scheduled event on a very distant calendar. Tonight, the horn sits where it usually sits, on a peg or a stand, gleaming faintly, more like a polished piece of furniture than an alarm. Heimdall will touch it every so often, not dramatically, just to be sure it's there, the way you might pat your pockets for keys before leaving the house. The horn waits. Heimdall waits. The bridge glows. In a universe full of noisy destinies, there is something soothing about a god whose heroism is mostly patience. People and gods pass over Bifrost, and Heimdall watches each of them without making it awkward. When the other gods go down to Midgard, they stride across the colors like commuters, crossing a very scenic crosswalk. Heimdall notes the weight of each step, the pattern of each gate, the way each set of footsteps sounds when it hits the same planks of the bridge. Over time, he builds a map in his hearing. He can tell who is coming by the way the colors hum, the way the air shifts. If you've ever learned to recognize someone by the sound of their walk in a hallway, you already understand his power just stretched out to cover entire worlds. It's strangely domestic for a cosmic job. Occasionally, he is visited simply for conversation, which must be a welcome change from listening to grass. A wandering human hero perhaps pauses in awe at the sight of the bridge, and Heimdall answers their questions in a voice that probably sounds like someone who has rehearsed the safety instructions 1,000 times, but still means them. The hero asks how the bridge can burn with fire and still be crossed safely. Heimdall explains, without giving away trade secrets, that some things are only dangerous if you rush. Move calmly, keep your balance, and even a burning rainbow becomes a walkway instead of a hazard. It's good advice in general, though the hero may not realize it. You could apply it to crossing a crowded street, or to reading a long message at midnight. When no one is passing and no one is talking, Heimdall listens downward. Midgard is busy in a very small way. Chickens sort out their personal disputes. A child drops a wooden toy and picks it up again. A door latch clicks as someone steps out to check the weather. Even though checking the weather in a Norse world is usually just confirming that it is some combination of cold and still thinking about being colder, Heimdall hears all of this as a soft, constant murmur, and he has to sort out which of it matters. Most does not. There is a subtle comedy in imagining a god standing at the edge of a rainbow, hearing everything from heroic boasts and mead halls to someone complaining that their socks are still damp and deciding with infinite restraint not to intervene. Then the scene tilts gently toward the idea of Heimdall as judge in small disputes, because some stories hint at his wisdom in law. You can picture him away from the bridge for a moment, still carrying his listening with him, sitting at an assembly where people present their arguments. One farmer says the boundary stone has wandered, which stones are not actually supposed to do. Another claims his neighbor goats have developed suspicious acrobatic skills and keep appearing in the wrong field. Heimdall listens without rolling his eyes. He has heard the world, after all. This is not the most dramatic thing it has said. He makes measured decisions the way someone might carefully cut a loaf of bread, so each slice is almost equal. It is less about cosmic justice and more about making sure everyone can go home with their dignity only lightly scuffed. And yet, even there, his senses are present. He notices tiny hesitations in voices, subtle shifts in weight, the way silence blooms after certain sentences. These are all clues. In a more anxious story, that would turn him into a terrifying interrogator. Here, it makes him closer to a patient teacher, someone who can tell when a child is not quite telling the truth about how the vase broke, and who chooses not to shout about it. He simply nudges things toward honesty, because honest systems creak less in the long run. The universe, like a wooden hall, benefits from good maintenance. Back at Bifrost, time stretches again. Days slide into nights and nights into days, and the rainbow seems to exist outside of all of them. Snow falls through it. Rain adds a second, more temporary rainbow nearby, which is frankly showing off. Heimdall watches these things with the quiet amusement of someone who has seen weather try the same tricks for centuries and still appreciates the effort. He adjusts his cloak, shifts his grip on his spear, and resumes his long exercise in nearly sleeping. There is a small, almost hidden irony in the fact that Heimdall can hear so much, but speaks relatively little. He is the opposite of someone who spends all day scrolling and then telling everyone about it. He is subscribed to every sound in creation, but rarely leaves a comment. Sometimes you can imagine him wanting to share a particularly strange noise he has just heard, a fox sneezing or a cartwheel squeaking in exactly the same rhythm as an old song, but holding back because there is work to do, and also because once you start telling people every detail, they will never stop asking for updates. Every so often, his fingers touch the Jallarhorn again. The horn knows it is part of a much louder fate, but tonight it is only furniture, curved and solid, smelling faintly of whatever polish the gods favor. Heimdall may even practice lifting it, just to be sure his arms still know the motion, the way a musician might silently finger the notes of a song. But he does not blow it. Not yet. The day when everything changes is scheduled far ahead, and this story prefers the quiet days before that, the endless, nearly identical shifts when nothing happens and that nothing matters. If you're still awake, you can let your thoughts rest on one more detail that myth gives us. Heimdall is sometimes called the whitest of the gods, associated with brightness and light. It doesn't have to mean anything dramatic. You can think of it as the color of early frost on a field, or sunlight caught on the surface of the bridge. He is a figure of clarity, the one who sees, the one who hears, the one who stands where colors meet the sky. There is something reassuring about knowing that someone, somewhere is paying attention, even when nothing urgent is happening. Especially then, so the watch goes on. The rainbow holds its arc across the sky. The worlds move and mutter below, full of small noises and small worries. Heimdall listens. He distinguishes between footsteps that belong and footsteps that do not. He files away the sound of your own day, the closing of a laptop, the sigh of a blanket being adjusted, the quiet click of a light being turned off as more harmless data in his great archive of non-emergencies. The horn stays hanging. The hall behind him stays warm. His eyes stay mostly open, and the story, like his watch, could continue without end, a gentle, unhurried vigilance at the edge of everything, while you, who do not need to guard a rainbow tonight, are free to do the simpler, braver thing and slowly, softly let go of the day. You might not think a tree that touches the sky would still need someone to water it. But in Norse mythology, even the world tree Yggdrasil relies on a kind of cosmic housekeeping. The image is usually drawn with grand seriousness, roots in many worlds, branches over everything, a whole ecosystem of squirrels and eagles and mysterious creatures. But if you look closer, somewhere under all that grandeur, there's also a very simple routine. Every day, more or less on time, someone has to get up, fetch water, and pour it carefully where the roots need it most. Fate, in this case, is being kept alive by something that looks suspiciously like a gardening chore. If you read listening from your bed or your couch or whatever soft surface has agreed to hold you tonight, you can quietly notice where you are and what time it is. If you're still awake in a little while, you can subscribe or not. The Norns aren't tracking your engagement. They are far too busy managing eternity's watering can. The Norns live beside a well called Urswell, or the Well of Fate, which already sounds like a place where dramatic prophecies should echo across the stones. In reality, or at least in the softer version of the story we're retelling, the well side is surprisingly ordinary. There is a stone rim worn smooth by hands, a bucket with a rope that creaks in a familiar way, and a patch of ground where the grass never quite recovers from all the footsteps. 3 Norns are most famous, Erdandi and Skuld, often translated as something like what once happened, what is happening, and what is yet to come. These sound like abstract concepts, but you can imagine them as 3 people who share an office, each convinced that her paperwork is the most urgent. Urs, the one with the old files, Verdandi is the one constantly answering new messages, and Skuld is the one quietly adding to the to-do list while the others aren't looking. Every day they rise and go about the same tasks. First comes water. The well's surface is usually calm, broken only by the small circles where a drop from somewhere above falls in, or a thin root dips down for a taste. The water is described as so holy that anything it touches becomes bright and whole, which sounds impressive, but also like a nice way of saying it is very good for plants. The Norns lower their bucket with practiced motions. The rope slides, the pulley makes a soft sound, wood against wood, and down below the water waits with endless patience. When the bucket returns, heavy and dark, they carry it together, because even beings of fate understand the wisdom of good ergonomics. There is no glory in a pulled back, even at the roots of the world. They pour the water over Yggdrasil's roots, and as they do, they also scoop up wet clay from around the well, the kind that sticks under fingernails and keeps its shape when squeezed. This mixture of water and mud is spread over the roots like a protective mask, the way someone might carefully apply moisturizer to keep their skin from cracking in winter. The myth says that's what keeps the tree from rotting or decaying, which gives you a very comforting picture of cosmic maintenance. The universe is not just held together by thunder and heroics. It is held together by 3 extremely determined women, making sure the base of the tree doesn't dry out. Between trips to the well, the Norns carve runes on wooden tablets or on the trunk itself, marking out lines of fate. It can sound frightening if you imagine it as a list of disasters. Tonight, though, think of it more like a schedule, or perhaps a calendar that never ends. Some of the lines are sharp and decisive. This king will fall. That battle will be lost. But many are small and almost tender. This child will one day love the smell of rain. That old woman will find a coin in a place she thought was empty. Someone you will never meet will choose the blue cloak instead of the red one, and feel strangely pleased about it all day. Fate is not only about big endings. It is also about the countless small preferences and coincidences that make a life feel like it belongs to you. Because they live so close to the well, the Norns have time to notice all these tiny details. They sit at the edge, sometimes with their feet braced against the stone, sometimes with their skirts tucked up to avoid the damp, and they listen. Water has a sound that is very good for listening to things that aren't actually spoken. The ripples carry hints of what is happening in the worlds above. A ship leaving harbor, a door closing, a promise whispered in a field. The Norns do not respond to every sound. That would be chaos. Instead, they let most of it pass by like background noise and only occasionally reach into the flow to nudge something. A rune added here, a line sharpened there. It's not unlike adjusting a picture frame on the wall so it hangs straight. The picture is still the same, it just looks calmer. Sometimes, when the day has been especially full of new fates to record, one of them will pause and comment on the sheer volume of human ambition. Do they ever rest? Skuld might ask, glancing into the water where futures swirl like fallen leaves. Verdandi might shrug, because she deals with the present and therefore knows exactly how many people are currently working too late. Who remembers everything, probably just smiles in that knowing way of someone who's seen this pattern repeat for a few thousand years. If you've ever had an older relative say, people have always been like this, with a mixture of affection and exasperation, you already understand Ur's whole personality. It may seem odd that three beings associated with such weighty concepts have such repetitive days, but repetition is soothing. They find comfort in the rhythm. Lower bucket, lift bucket, water roots, smooth clay, carve rune, read ripple, repeat. If you think about it, their routine is not so different from your own small habits. Brushing your teeth, checking that a door is locked, scrolling through the same app even when nothing new has appeared. The difference is that the Norn's habits keep a tree from dying and a universe from unraveling, whereas your habits mostly keep your phone from feeling neglected. Still, the shape of the comfort is similar. Once in a while, visitors come. Gods, heroes, the occasional wandering spirit who somehow manages to find the path to the well. They ask questions, of course, because that is what everyone does when they meet someone who might know the future. Some ask with trembling voices about their fate in battle. Others, more quietly, ask about love or children, or whether they will ever be truly remembered. In the louder versions of the story, the Norns respond with riddles or silence or blunt truths. In this gentler version, you can imagine them answering with the kind of honesty that doesn't overwhelm. You will face hard things, they might say, which is true for everyone. You will be surprised by moments of peace, which is also true. You will not understand everything while it is happening, but you will understand some things later. It's not the sort of prophecy that gets carved into stone, but it's the kind you can comfortably fall asleep under. There is a small, dry humor in the fact that even the gods, who are supposed to be powerful and decisive, come here to double-check their own storylines. Odin, in particular, is notorious for this. He wants knowledge in all its forms, and that includes peeking at the script of the universe whenever possible. You can picture him standing at the edge of the well, one eye gazing down, cloak fluttering just enough to look dramatic, asking the Norns about the end of all things. They, who already spend their days handling too much information, must feel like the cosmic equivalent of customer support dealing with the same ticket over and over. Yes, Odin, they could say politely, Ragnarok is still scheduled. No, we cannot give you an exact date. Yes, we'll send a notification when something changes. Then they go back to their watering. The funny thing is that the Norns themselves have a kind of patience most of us only manage for a few minutes at a time. They watch lives unfold in patterns that repeat, but they don't seem bored. Perhaps that's because each life, each story still has its own texture. One person's courage looks different from another's. One person's kindness leaves a different shape in the water. The three Norns can appreciate those shapes without needing every story to be unique in a loud way. It's a good reminder that quiet variation is still variation. Not every life has to be a saga. Most are more like short, beautifully repetitive poems. As the day ages, the light around the well changes. Early on, it is clear and bright, showing every line in the stone, every root hair reaching toward the damp. Later, it turns softer, more like the inside of a shell. Shadows from Yggdrasil's enormous trunk stretch out, and the Norns adjust their positions so they can keep working without squinting. Their tools, knives for carving, ladles for scooping water, small brushes for spreading clay are laid out on a flat rock like items on a quiet workstation. There is no rush to put them away. Fate does not clock out at sunset. But even so, there is a sense of winding down. The big decisions were mostly carved in earlier. The evening is for tidying loose threads, making sure nothing urgent has slipped through the ripples. You can imagine in the softer telling that they sometimes talk among themselves about small, almost gossipy things the well has shown them. A fisherman who keeps singing the same verse wrong, but with so much confidence that the sea seems to accept it as a new version. A child who insists on naming every single chicken in a yard, including the ones that look exactly alike. A woman who never goes anywhere without 3 extra hairpins, just in case, and does in fact use all 3 in the span of an ordinary day. None of these people will appear in heroic poems, but their lives still send patterns through the water, and the Norns, who know how crowded the universe is with tragedies, seem to enjoy these harmless little ripples. As night settles, if night can be said to exist in a place where a world tree blocks and holds so much light, the work at the well becomes quieter still. There's less carving now and more watching. The Norns lean back slightly, perhaps, resting their hands while their eyes stay open. The water continues its endless rise and fall. Somewhere high above, on Yggdrasil's branches, an eagle shifts its weight. Somewhere along the trunk, the squirrel Ratatosk is undoubtedly carrying an insult from top to bottom, or bottom to top, because that seems to be his entire personality. The Norns hear all of this, but it does not disturb them. Everyone has a role. Some roles are important and loud. Some are important and repetitive. They were assigned the latter, and they have made peace with that. You can, if you like, think of the Norns whenever you feel trapped in your own routines. Folding laundry, washing dishes, refreshing the same page. It's tempting to believe nothing significant can happen in such moments, but in a way, those are the spaces where fate gets its quiet work done. Decisions simmer. Old thoughts dissolve. New ones arrive softly, like water seeping into dry soil. Perhaps somewhere, while they pour from the well, the Norns look up and briefly witness you doing something extremely ordinary and add a tiny note to your line of runes. Here they are, keeping things going again. It's not glamorous, but glamour is overrated. Stability is strangely beautiful. Eventually, even beings of fate deserve rest, though they never entirely stop. Maybe keeper of the past closes her eyes first, trusting that what has already been written will not rewrite itself while she naps. Verdandi stays alert a little longer because the present is always misbehaving. Skuld, who frets about the future, probably pretends she is just resting her eyes while continuing to imagine new possibilities. The well keeps its own counsel, the tree drinks. The roots, wrapped in holy water and careful clay, hold firm. And the story, like the water in the well, does not really end. It only circles. Tomorrow the Norns will rise again. The rope will creak in the same way. The bucket will return heavier than it left. The roots will be watered. New runes will be carved. Old ones will be read and maybe smiled at. Somewhere else, on some smaller scale, you will likely repeat your own patterns. Some of them chosen, some of them inherited, all of them combining into the quiet script of your life. And while you lie here listening, you don't have to solve any of that. You can let the Norns keep track for a while. Let them watch the ripples and draw the lines, while your own thoughts sink gently down to where the water is cool and slow and deep, and the roots of your day can rest. You might not think a goddess would worry about split ends, but in Norse mythology, one of the quietest problems ever to trouble. Asgard begins with hair, a comb, and the kind of silence that only happens when someone is absolutely not talking about what they did. Sif's hair is famous, of course. It is said to fall like a field of golden grain, which is a lovely compliment until you remember how much work it is to keep a whole field untangled. Tonight we are not here for the dramatic moment when the hair is cut. That mischief has already happened somewhere off to the side of the story, far enough away that you don't have to wake up for it. We are here for the slow, careful aftermath, when everyone has calmed down enough to think about things like replacement, regrowth, and what exactly one asks for when visiting a dwarf for custom hair. In the halls of Asgard, Sif moves through spaces that are used to seeing her with that shining, sun-colored hair. The benches, the pillars, the shields on the walls, they all remember it in their own way. Now, with her head wrapped in a soft cloth, those same spaces feel different. Not worse, just waiting. There is an odd politeness in the air, as if the furniture has decided not to stare. Sif herself is calm in that steady, quiet way that makes even gods feel slightly guilty around her. She does not shout, she does not threaten. She simply exists with a kind of composed disappointment that can make a thunder god reconsider his life choices. Loki, who started all this by cutting her hair as a prank, has already felt that look, and that is why at this particular moment he is on his best behavior, which is still not very good, but is at least pointed in a useful direction. Somewhere between apology and self-preservation, Loki has promised that Sif's hair will not only be restored, but improved, spun anew by dwarves who work metal the way other people work yarn. This means a journey to their forges, down below the comfortable upper worlds, where caves hold more light than the sky because of all the glowing metal and a ton of fire. You can picture the start of that trip as surprisingly ordinary. Boots being laced a cloak chosen, maybe someone double-checking that a small offering has been tucked into a pocket, because even tricksters know better than to arrive at a dwarven workshop empty-handed. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe or don't. Think of it as choosing whether to bring a gift to the story. The dwarves will continue hammering either way. The dwarves' halls are not vast, echoing caverns, at least not in this sleepy version. They are more like a network of interconnected workshops, each one full of benches, tools, and half-finished ideas. Metal sings here in different registers. There is the sharp ring of hammer on anvil, the softer hiss of something being cooled in water, the small clinks of tools being set back in their proper places by people who cannot tolerate clutter. Dwarves in Norse myth are mastersmiths, the ones who forge treasures like Thor's hammer and Odin's spear, but they also, by implication, make more practical items. Hinges that don't complain, chains that don't twist, buckles that apparently never go out of style. Tonight, they are being asked for something unusual, even by their standards. Hair that is also metal gold, that will grow like grain, and yet behave like hair lying softly against Sif's head, as if it had never been gone. The brothers who take on the task stories give different names. You may know them as the sons of Vivaldi, or as part of Brock and Sinji, as Circle treat the commission with professional seriousness. To them, this is just another engineering problem wearing a poetic disguise. They examine the lock of Sif's remaining hair, studying its color and texture, the way a jeweler studies a stone. They discuss options in low voices that sound like rumbling bellows. Should the new hair be pure gold, or some alloy that resists tingling? How should it attach to her scalp without causing discomfort? Will it be self-cleaning, or should the enchantment at least reduce the need for combing? It is strangely easy to imagine a technical debate about divine hair care, complete with sketches on a soot-dark wall. While they work, time stretches in the way it does whenever someone is waiting for a change they cannot make themselves. Up in Asgard, Sif continues her days, her head still covered. She helps with the household because being a goddess does not exempt her from the endless logistics of communal living, organizing stores of grain, managing linen, making sure that feasts happen with the kind of smoothness that makes everyone underestimate how much effort went in. People try not to stare at her scarf-wrapped head, but gossip flows in gentle, looping paths, the way it always does. Someone wonders aloud what the new hair will look like. Someone else says that if it is made by dwarves, it will probably be indestructible, which sounds convenient for braiding. There's a soft humor in the way the gods react. Thor, who loves Sif deeply but is not always skilled with nuance, keeps offering practical solutions that are completely unhelpful. At one point, he may suggest that she simply borrow his helmet until the problem is solved, as if the answer to a missing field of golden grain or a piece of metal shaped like a bucket. Sif thanks him with patient politeness because that is the sort of person she is, and then continues to tie her scarf just a little more securely. Other goddesses offer oils, combs, and quiet solidarity. They know what it is to have their identity tied, literally, to how they appear. But beneath all these small gestures is the steady background expectation that the dwarves will deliver on their promise. Dwarves almost always do. They complain first, but then they deliver. Far below, in the warmth of the forge, the gold is being heated and drawn out into impossibly fine threads. This is not the heavy gold of coins or goblets. It has to move like hair. The dwarves pull it in long, gleaming lines, stretching it thinner than a sewing thread, until it almost hums when touched. They work with tools so small they would look like jewelry to anyone else, using tweezers and tiny hammers, muttering measurements that don't exist in ordinary carpentry. Every strand is enchanted as it is made, given a kind of behavioral script. Cling together just enough to form braids, separate just enough to move in the wind, grow from the roots as ordinary hair would, but do not tarnish. Do not break, do not fall out casually during conversation. If you listen closely in your imagination, you can hear their test phrases. One dwarf lifts a single strand, holds it up to the forge light, and says something like, "Drop." The strand falls with the softness of silk. Another says, "Shine," and the thread catches the light in a way that would make a jeweler weep. They nod, satisfied. The magic is working. There are still hundreds, thousands of strands to make. This could feel overwhelming, but dwarves understand the power of repetition. One more strand, one more enchantment, one more adjustment. It is not so different from knitting a very large sweater. You do not think about the whole garment at once. You think about the next stitch. Meanwhile, Loki is living through the slow-burning discomfort of a person who has caused a problem that cannot be fixed quickly. Every time he sees Sif, her covered head is a quiet reminder. Not a raised voice, not a thrown object, just a cloth and an absence. For someone who thrives on attention, this kind of gentle, persistent disapproval is more effective than any thunderbolt. He tries small acts of helpfulness to balance things out, some of which are actually useful. He volunteers for tedious errands. He stays out of obvious trouble, which is almost suspicious. He even, on one memorable day, offers to help peel vegetables for a feast, though the kitchen staff quickly redirect him to something less knife-related. Back in the forge, the strands are being gathered. The dwarves twist and group them into locks, weaving tiny braids at the base where they will attach. The whole process requires the kind of focus that makes hours disappear. They do not rush because rushing ruins metal. Instead, they work in a steady tempo, hammer, stretch, twist, enchant, cool, and set aside. Somewhere along the way, one dwarf remarks that they are essentially making a crop of golden grain that will grow not from soil but from skin. When the hair is finally ready, it is bundled not in a chest but in a cloth to keep it from tangling. It is light in the hands, almost weightless, yet when you look at it, you can tell it carries the value of a kingdom's treasury. Loki is tasked with delivering it, which is both a risk and a test. The dwarves hand it to him with the solemn expectation that for once he will treat cargo with reverence. To everyone's mild surprise, he does. On the journey back, he holds the bundle as carefully as a person might hold a sleeping cat that they are afraid of waking. In some tellings, he may be accompanied by other treasures the dwarves have forged as part of a wager, but those more competitive details can stay offstage tonight. Our focus is simply on the returning gold, soft and silent in his arms. The moment when the hair is attached could easily be framed as a dramatic revelation. In this story, it is a long, patient process, more like a careful salon visit than a miracle. Sif sits on a low stool, the way countless people have sat for countless hair appointments, shoulders relaxed, hands resting in her lap. A goddess skilled in healing or in magic, perhaps Frigg, perhaps another gently works the golden locks into her scalp. The new hair takes hold as if it has been waiting for this exact head. Strand by strand, it anchors itself, finding roots where there were none. The room is quiet except for soft words and the occasional clink of a hairpin. Slowly, the scarf is no longer needed. The gold spills down, not with the weight of metal, but with the softness of real hair. It shines like grain in sunlight, just as the old poet said, but now it also carries the subtle glint of the forge. Sif lifts a hand and touches it, feeling the warmth of the threads, the way they move between her fingers. She weighs her reflection in a polished shield or a bowl of still water. The others in the room hold their breath, because even gods can be nervous about haircuts. Then Sif smiles, small but unmistakable. The tension that has stretched over the household for days loosens, like a bowstring finally allowed to relax. The gold hair is not just decoration. It is a symbol that the mistake has been acknowledged and addressed, that community effort, dwarves, trickster, goddess, all involved, has turned a thoughtless act into an oddly collaborative project. The story could turn triumphant here, but it doesn't need to. Instead, it settles into the quiet knowledge that things are, if not exactly as they were, at least whole again. From that day forward, Sif's hair has an extra layer of meaning. It is still the image of ripening fields and summer abundance, but it is also a reminder of repair, of the possibility that some damage can be undone with enough patience, skill, and humility. The dwarves return to their forges. Loki, having narrowly avoided permanent exile from the nicer parts of Asgard, gradually slides back into his usual mischief, though perhaps with a slightly longer pause now before he acts. Sif goes back to her routines, tending to the home, offering counsel, standing in doorways where the light loves her hair. The gold sways when she walks, glows when she laughs, and behaves itself even on windy days. And the story can go on like that, looping gently. A goddess combing hair made of metal that flows like water. A forge full of dwarves refining their already perfect technique, just in case another god's hairstyle ever needs emergency intervention. A hall where the memory of a scarf-wrapped head makes everyone a little more careful with their jokes. Somewhere in all of this, you can find your own small parallels. The slow regrowth after something has been cut back, the hidden labor behind what looks effortless the way people come together to fix what one moment of carelessness damaged. Nothing explodes. No final battle begins. The world tree is still standing. The rainbow bridge still glows. The apples of youth are still being checked in their basket. And in one quiet corner of Asgard, on an ordinary morning, Sif sits by a window, brushing her golden hair with unhurried strokes, each pass of the comb as soft and repetitive as breathing. Outside, the wind moves through the real fields, making waves in the grain that look, from a distance, very much like the motion of her hair. The resemblance is gentle and not accidental, and as you listen, you can let your thoughts move the same way back and forth until they blur into something as simple as sleep. You might not think eternity would need an entertainment plan, but in Norse mythology, there is a god whose quiet job is basically to make sure the afterlife never runs out of stories to tell over dinner. and his name is Bragi. He is the god of poetry and eloquence, which makes him sound a little like a walking bookshelf. But in the soft light of Valhalla's never-quite-ending evening, he is more like a very patient host at a very long feast. Imagine an endless hall lined with benches, shields on the walls, torches that never quite burn down, and an audience of warriors who technically died in battle but now spend most of their time doing the timeless equivalent of sitting around after work with snacks. Somewhere down the long table, Bragi has his own place. A carved chair worn smooth where his elbows rest when he leans forward to start yet another tale. If you're listening from your own bench, which might be a bed, a couch, or a pile of pillows that has bravely volunteered as both, you can notice how it feels to settle there. And if you're still awake in a little while, you can subscribe. Or not. Bragi is used to audiences drifting off mid-story. He tends to take it as a compliment. Bragi's most famous feature is his tongue, which some storytellers say is carved with runes. Little lines of power etched right into the muscle, like someone turned his mouth into a portable inscription stone. It sounds dramatic, but you can also think of it as the mythic version of permanent notes. The words he needs are literally written down where he can't lose them. His beard is described as long and beautifully shaped, the sort of beard that must demand a surprising amount of maintaining, even in paradise. You can imagine him carefully combing it before a feast, muttering lines of verse to himself while he works out tangles, as if thinking about meter helps with knots. Around him, the hall is filling. Benches creak as warriors sit. The smell of roasted meat drifts through the air, and drinking horns are passed from hand to hand. Valhalla is famous for battles by day and feasts by night, but the quieter truth is that the feasts are long, and even the bravest fighter appreciates a good story to pass the hours between refills. That is where Bragi comes in, carrying tailies the way other people carry trays. He doesn't begin with a shout. He rarely does. Instead, somewhere between the clink of one horn and the next, his voice just appears at the edge of the noise, soft and steady, like a new instrument quietly joining a familiar song. He might start with something gently surprising, such as the claim that there is a right way and a wrong way to sit on a bench if you want a poem to behave. This earns him a few glances, mostly curious, some amused. Bragi explains, in his patient way, that poems are shy creatures. They prefer to approach people who are almost comfortable but not quite, the ones who are just adjusting their cloak or rearranging their cup when the first line arrives. Having the entire hall adjust itself all at once is good practice, and also a harmless joke on the audience, who now think about their own posture for a moment, which is never a bad thing after hours of sitting. The stories he chooses are often about small details rather than world-ending events. He might talk about the Mead of Poetry, brewed from the blood of the wise being Vizier and stored in carefully named vats somewhere below ground. But rather than focusing on the thefts and bargains, he lingers on how someone had to label those vats so no one mixed them up with the ordinary mead. You can imagine a dwarf standing in a busy storeroom with a piece of charcoal, writing neat runic names on each container, pausing every so often to make sure he isn't accidentally calling one Friday soup. Bragi describes the taste of that mead not as lightning or thunder, but as the quiet feeling you get when a sentence comes out exactly right on the first try. The warriors, used to roaring metaphors, blink slowly and find themselves nodding. They know that feeling too, even if for them it usually happens when a shouted boast lands perfectly in a crowded hall. Asterisk now and then. Bragi includes his listeners in his tailies. He'll mention a nameless warrior who always sits with his elbow on the table in exactly that way, or a shield that has clearly seen more polishing than combat. And the hall ripples with soft laughter as people recognize themselves in these harmless little caricatures. He is careful with his humor. It is never sharp enough to cut, only sharp enough to carve out recognition. That's part of his gift, shaping words so that they lie comfortably against the listener instead of digging in. If you've ever been gently teased by someone who knows you well and loves you anyway, you understand the mood he creates. The hall relaxes. The clatter softens. The stories deepen, but they do not darken dot between longer tailies. Bragi fills the spaces with small poetic games. He might describe a shield entirely without using the word shield, calling it a storm wall, a spear roof, or a ring eater, inviting the audience to imagine new kennings of their own. In the sagas, these poetic compounds are a serious art form, but here they become a sleepy pastime, something to toy with the way a person might idly twist a ring on their finger. One listener suggests calling an oar a sea broom because it brushes the waves aside. Another proposes fjord finger. The suggestions range from clever to ridiculous, but Bragi treats them all with the same thoughtful nod, like a teacher collecting assignments. It's a quiet kind of participation that keeps the mind just busy enough to stay awake, while the body continues its slow slide toward rest. He also loves origin stories of ordinary things, not grand weapons or world trees, but small customs that no one really questions anymore. For example, he might explain in soothing detail why drinking horns in Valhalla are always passed with the right hand, or why some benches have exactly 3 carved rings on their legs. Perhaps those rings mark the number of times the bench has been repaired after enthusiastic celebrations. Perhaps the right-hand rule began with one particularly clumsy warrior who spilled mead every time he tried the left, and the others quietly standardized around his stronger side to prevent future accidents. None of this needs to be historically accurate. It just needs to feel true enough to make the hall murmur with amused recognition dot in one gently meandering story. Bragi speaks of his wife, Idunn, the keeper of apples, and how their roles make a kind of domestic symmetry. She keeps the gods young with fruit. He keeps their stories fresh with words. He does not dramatize their relationship. Instead, he describes small, almost ordinary scenes, an apple set beside his cup as he writes, her laughter from the next room when he tries out a new verse aloud and accidentally rhymes something with the wrong name. He claims with a smile in his voice that the gods owe half their great decisions to good timing with snacks and conversation, which may be more accurate than anyone wants to admit. In your own life, you might remember how many important talks have happened over tea, coffee, or something equally simple. Valhalla, for all its golden ceilings, is in that different dot as the evening goes on. The hall grows softer around the edges. Torches gutter down to a steady glow. The thunder of earlier boasting has faded into a low, steady murmur, the sound a crowd makes when everyone has run out of new stories and is content to revisit old ones. Bragi's voice travels easily in that half-quiet. He tells of a time when a single misplaced word nearly ruined a treaty, and how a hastily invented verse smoothed everything over again. He doesn't name the kings involved. The point of the story is not who they were, but the idea that words can be little levers, nudging heavy situations in gentler directions. He compares it to adjusting a bench so it doesn't wobble, a matter of a folded scrap of wood under one leg, barely visible, and suddenly the whole structure feels stable. Listeners nod, thinking of their own small adjustments, their own careful phrases offered in tense moments. Sometimes he moves from spoken story into something closer to song, though he never quite crosses the line into full performance. The melody is simple, almost like chanting, the kind of tune that could go on for hours without tiring the voice or the ear. The words travel through familiar images, ships on waves, ravens on branches, the smell of pine smoke on wool. None of it leads to a grand climax. It's more like walking in circles around the same set of stones until they feel like home. People who started the evening wide awake begin to soften around the eyes. A head leans back against a pillar. A hand still holding a horn grows heavier, then slowly loosens until a nearby friend quietly steadies it. Bragi notices and adjusts his pace, letting his sentences grow a little longer, his pauses a little deeper, the way a good lullaby dips gently between notes. One of his favorite tricks is to tell stories about possible futures that never happened, little what-if tales that branch away from known myths. What if a hero had decided to stay home one particular day instead of going to battle? What if a ship had turned back because of a slightly stronger wind? What if a raven had chosen a different roof to land on? These imagined paths are harmless because they resolve into nothing. Small worlds that bloom for a moment in the listener's mind and then fold away again like foam on a wave. They are strangely soothing because they remind everyone that for every grand event they lived or died through, there were 1,000 other ways things could have gone. In a hall full of people who have already used up their single dramatic life, it is comforting to wander through unused possibilities with no obligation to act on any of them. Through it all, Bragi himself stays unhurried. He knows that in Valhalla, unlike in ordinary life, there's always more time. If a story stretches too long, there is tomorrow's feast and the one after that. He never has to think, I must wrap this up quickly. Instead, he lets each tale end the way embers end a fire, not with a snap, but with a soft dimming. When he senses the hall has drifted far enough into relaxation, he doesn't announce that he's finished. He simply lets his last sentence trail into an image, perhaps of a quiet fjord at dusk, boats moored and still, water dark and calm as a closed eye, and then allows the silence to widen around it. The warriors, some awake, some halfway to dreams, breathe out together. The hall settles. If you're still listening now, you might notice how your own thoughts have started to behave like Bragi's stories. They circle familiar scenes from your day, changing small details, trying out alternate versions, then letting them fade. You remember a conversation and add a line you wish you'd said, or remove one you regret, then watch the whole thing dissolve like mist anyway. This is a kind of late-night poetry your mind writes for itself, sorting experience into quieter shapes. Bragi would probably approve. He might even say that this is when people are closest to understanding his craft, not when they are fully alert, but when they are just tired enough that metaphors feel natural and time feels soft. Somewhere in the long hall of Valhalla, the feast continues in slow motion. Platters are pushed a little further along the table. A few remaining voices murmur over old stories that Bragi told years ago, or last night, or perhaps a century back. It's hard to keep track in a place where the days are all cousins of each other. Bragi sits where he always sits, with his rune-marked tongue resting behind closed lips for now, listening to the low rhythm of breathing and the occasional faint clink as a cup settles against wood. He knows there will be more tales tomorrow, more origin stories for everyday customs, more imagined lives branching gently away from the known sagas, more jokes about bench etiquette and heroic snoring. For tonight, though, he is content simply to be the quiet presence at the table, the keeper of words in a hall where even warriors are allowed, finally, to relax. And you, who are not expected to fight any mythic battles in the morning, can borrow a little of that permission. You don't have to remember every line or decide which part was the important part. Let the details scatter like crumbs on a table after a meal. Let the images of golden beards, echoing halls, and carefully labeled mead vats drift to the back of your mind, where they can rest with everything else you don't need to carry consciously. Somewhere beyond all that, there is just your own slow breathing, steady as Bragi's voice and simple, ancient fact that stories are allowed to go on without you for a while, so that you can do the quieter, older thing they were always meant to support, closing your eyes and gently, gradually falling asleep. You might not think a god of mischief would be afraid of a meeting, but that is exactly where Loki finds himself when the apples go missing and the first fine lines show up around divine eyes. There is no dramatic thunder, no shouted accusation at first, just a slow gathering of gods in the long hall, each of them rubbing at a stiff joint or blinking a little harder than usual, as if the air has gotten sharper overnight. Someone suggests that maybe the weather is changing. Someone else mentions they slept on their arm wrong. Then a third god, who has a very good memory for small routines, quietly says, "When was the last time we saw Idunn's basket?" And the whole room, as one, turns to look at Loki, who suddenly feels like the only person in a play who has forgotten his lines. The thing about Loki is that he is almost always guilty of something, just not necessarily the thing he is being blamed for at any given moment. Right now, however, he is in that rare and uncomfortable position of being exactly responsible. He knows where Idunn is, somewhere beyond Asgard, beyond the walls, lured out by his own smooth words and clever comparisons, with her apples of youth tucked safely under her arm. He had made it sound like a pleasant stroll, an opportunity, a new tree with even better fruit. He had done it because the giant had threatened him, and because saying no is not a skill he has practiced as much as making improvisational promises. At the time it had felt, if not harmless, then at least survivable. Now, as he watches Odin's hand tremble just enough to splash mead onto the table, he realizes that survivable may have been optimistic. The meeting begins in that slow, formal style the gods like to pretend is natural to them. Odin calls for everyone to sit, chairs scrape, cloaks are adjusted, someone coughs. The air feels thick, like a room where a storm might someday happen but hasn't decided yet. No one wants to say the obvious first. It hovers in the middle of the table like a fourth, helping of something too heavy to finish. Loki tries very hard to look like a person who is deeply concerned, but also entirely uninvolved. He even folds his hands on the table, which is his version of being serious. Unfortunately, the effect is ruined by the fact that his fingers keep fidgeting with one another, as if they are trying to escape. Odin begins with questions. "We are all feeling different," he says, with the understatement of someone who noticed his beard turning a slightly duller white that morning. "We age more than we should. We tire sooner. This did not happen when Idunn's apples were part of our day. So we must ask, where has she gone?" The question is technically addressed to the hall, but everyone's eyes have already drifted to Loki again, like iron filings sliding slowly toward a magnet. To their credit, the gods do not immediately shout. They simply wait, which is somehow worse. Silence in a large room is heavy. It puts weight on the person everyone is thinking about, and Loki can feel that weight settle across his shoulders like a very judgmental cloak. He tries a small smile first, the kind he usually uses to turn blame into comedy. "Idunn is taking a little trip," he says, carefully, as if the right tone might make the words sound less alarming. "She needed some fresh air. Apples like variety, you know. If they always see the same ceiling, they sulk." A few gods frown, not because they suspect the lie yet, but because they have never once considered the emotional landscape of fruit. Odin, who has traded an eye for wisdom, and therefore has no patience left for poorly framed explanations, leans forward. "Where?" he asks. "Is she exactly?" The word "exactly" is where the pressure begins to tighten, like a belt cinched one notch too far. Loki feels it. He remembers the giant Chazi's shadow, the promise he made to save his own skin, the way Idunn had trusted him because he made it sound like a small adventure, nothing more. He thinks about lying. It is his instinct, his favorite sport. But lying in front of a room full of gods who can now count the new aches in their knees like beads on a string does not seem wise. He stalls instead. "Not here," he says, which is technically true and completely unhelpful. The room does not laugh. Even Thor, who sometimes enjoys Loki's ridiculous answers, remains very still, his hand flexing slowly on the table as if it is remembering what it feels like to grip a hammer. Gradually, the questions grow more pointed. Did you see her leave? Someone asks. Did you speak to her? Was anyone with her? Each query presses in from a new angle, and Loki feels like a piece of metal being tapped by many small hammers, looking for weaknesses. The more he dodges, the heavier the room becomes. He starts to notice little details he would normally turn into jokes. How Frigg's braid is coming slightly undone at the end, how Heimdall rubs the bridge of his nose as if his all-seeing eyes are tired, how even Freyr sits down slower than usual, as if his legs have turned from saplings into young trees overnight. These are not the kind of details you mock when you are the one who removed the protection that kept everyone feeling ageless. Eventually, Odin says the thing that changes the air. Loki, he begins in a tone that is not angry but worse, it is weary. You are clever and you are careless, and we have tolerated both because they have been useful. But if you know where Idunn is and do not tell us, then you are not simply a nuisance. You are a risk to all of us, and that we cannot allow. The word risk moves through the hall like a cold draft. Loki has always been called many things, trickster, shapeshifter, liar, but risk to all of us is new, and it does not sit comfortably. It settles into the corners of his mind, into the spaces where he usually stores his jokes. Under that calm, heavy gaze, Loki's resistance finally crumbles, not in a dramatic confession, but in a small, tired exhale. All right, he says, more to the table than to anyone in particular. She is beyond the walls. I took her there. Chazi asked. Chazi insisted. He has her and the apples. It seemed simpler at the time. There is a brief, stunned silence, followed by a collective intake of breath that feels almost coordinated. Even gods, it turns out, can be shocked into synchronized breathing exercises. A few hands move as if to reach for weapons, but then stop halfway as joints protest. It is very hard to storm out in righteous fury when your knees are suddenly acting their age. The pressure shifts now. It is no longer mostly social. It becomes logistical. Odin's questions are practical. Can she be retrieved? What form does Chazi wear? How far did you go? Thor's questions are equally practical but louder. How big is he? Can he be hit? Loki answers as best he can, feeling more like a witness than a co-conspirator, which is a small improvement. Still, every answer confirms what the gods already suspect, that the situation is both serious and annoyingly complicated. They will need cunning as well as strength. Unfortunately for Loki, cunning is a resource they currently associate with him, and that means he is not only the cause of the problem, but also, unavoidably, part of the solution. Odin does not shout. He simply says, "You will bring her back." The statement lands on the table with the weight of law. Loki opens his mouth to suggest alternatives, perhaps a committee, perhaps a task force, perhaps literally anyone else, but the look he receives from the assembled faces makes him close it again. He is not being asked. He is being assigned. The gods, who have loved and tolerated his chaos in small doses, are now compressing all their worry, irritation, and reluctant dependence into one directive. Fix this. There's a kind of humor, if you squint, in watching Loki under this kind of pressure. He is used to slipping sideways through expectations, dodging them, reshaping them. Now they cling to him like burrs. He finds himself thinking through plans not for the joy of it, but because the alternative is watching Odin's hands continue to tremble, and Thor's strength continue to leak away. It is a bit like discovering that the fire you were playing with for entertainment has gotten into the walls, and now you are holding the only bucket of water. Mischief stops being fun when the ceiling starts to sag. That night, while many of the gods try to sleep and discover that even rest feels different when you are subtly older, Loki walks the high places of Asgard. He moves along the walls, looks out into the dark lands beyond, and considers his options. The moonlight is unhelpfully calm. It does not offer advice. He thinks about running just for a moment, disappearing into some clever disguise, letting the story move on without him. But where would he go? The giants are not his friends. Chassi certainly isn't. The other worlds are full of beings who hold grudges longer than even Loki can keep track of. And anyway, the idea of leaving the gods to stiffen and wither because of his mistakes sits badly. Even in his flexible conscience, for all his sharp edges, these are his people. He has laughed with them, argued with them, tricked, and been tricked back. Abandoning them would mean abandoning his favorite audience, and he is too much of a performer for that. So, under the quiet sky, he begins to plan. The pressure of expectation becomes a kind of metronome, ticking through his thoughts. He remembers Shazi's shape, an eagle in some tellings, a shadow in others, and the way Idunn had looked over her shoulder one last time as they left the safety of the walls. Half curious, half reassured by his easy chatter. He thinks about disguises he could wear, routes he could take, favors he could call in from beings who owe him small debts. It is strange, but the seriousness of the task makes his mind clearer than usual. Without the usual wiggle room for mischief, the paths are fewer, sharper. He will have to slip into the giant's realm, find Idunn, and somehow escape with both her and the apples, all while not getting caught and not letting his own fear turn him back. The next day, the gods watch him prepare. There is a quiet in their observation that feels different from their usual wary amusement. It is not, what will he do now, so much as, will he actually do this? Odin hands him a cloak, not magical in itself, but warm against the chill winds beyond the walls. Frigg offers a few words that sound like advice and blessing woven together. Thor, uncharacteristically subdued, merely clamps a heavy hand on Loki's shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth and says, "Bring her back, or I will find you first." It is half threat, half reluctant encouragement, and Loki accepts both. As he approaches the edge of Asgard, the pressure shifts again, becoming a kind of narrowed focus. For once, his usual swirl of thoughts quiets. He doesn't think about tricks he might play on his way back, or jokes he might make at the feast. He thinks about timing, about distance, about how quickly giants can move when they are annoyed. He thinks about how Idunn must feel, taken from her routine of quiet apple keeping into a place that does not smell like home. The more he imagines her worry, the less comfortable he feels with his own. It has nowhere to sit. It keeps sliding off the edges of his thoughts and landing as resolve. From the outside, if you watched him shrink into the distance, you might not see any of this. You would see only a small figure in a cloak, setting out across a landscape that doesn't particularly care who he is, one more being moving between worlds. But inside his mind, the pressure that began as blame and fear has crystallized into something oddly sturdy, the decision to be clever for someone else's sake instead of his own. It's a new experience. It fits more tightly than his usual motives, but it holds. Back in Asgard, time moves differently now that the gods know what has gone wrong. Each day without apples adds a tiny weight to their bodies and their moods. They move a little slower through their routines, checking the walls, training, managing the small operations of a home that just happens to be divine. They find themselves telling stories about Loki, partly to entertain each other, partly to reassure themselves that he has always been slippery, but somehow reliable when it truly mattered. They remember times he helped resolve a problem he originally caused, looping chaos back into usefulness. It's not the most comforting pattern, but it is a pattern. The pressure on Loki does not lift as he travels. It travels with him, a quiet companion. Instead of the fun kind of adrenaline that used to tangle with his pranks, he carries a steady, low hum of responsibility. It feels to him a little like having promised a child he will be back soon, and then realizing that soon has a clock attached. He quickens his pace not because someone is chasing him, but because, in a way, everyone is waiting. Even the giants who don't know the plan yet are part of the equation. Their potential anger presses at the edges of his thoughts like distant thunder. And so Loki walks on between worlds under a sky that does not change as quickly as his thoughts once did, carrying with him the weight of all those glances in the hall, all those aching joints, all that silent expectation. The pressure that once felt like a noose becomes, step by step, more like a guide rope, something that keeps him moving in one direction instead of spinning in circles of his own making. He is still himself, quick, twisting, ready to improvise. But for now, those skills are pointed outward, toward bringing home the apples and the goddess who keeps them, toward easing the stiffness in divine shoulders and smoothing the new lines from divine faces. The story of how he will do it, how he will borrow a shape, trick a giant, and race home with feathers beating the air, belongs to the next part of the tale, the one filled with borrowed wings and desperate speed. Tonight we stay here, on the quieter side of the story, with Loki standing at the edge of Asgard, feeling the full, heavy attention of the gods at his back and the uncertain road ahead. It is a strange kind of stillness, the pause between being blamed and beginning to fix what you have broken. If you listen closely, you can almost hear his breath as he gathers himself, not for a punchline, not for a prank, but for a task. And while he steps into the space beyond the walls, you are free to do the opposite. To step away from your own pressures for a while, letting them blur at the edges as your thoughts move more slowly, like a trickster finally walking in a straight line, and your body, unlike the gods without their apples, is allowed to feel heavier and heavier until the only task left for you is to sleep. You might not think a rescue mission could sound like instructions for a very long, very gentle walk, but that is exactly what Loki decides it needs to be when he finally sets out to bring Idunn and her apples home. The gods had given him their expectations, their warnings, and in Thor's case, a farewell pat on the shoulder that was only a little like being struck with a friendly boulder. Beyond the walls of Asgard, the air feels cooler, less polished, like the world before someone has straightened the furniture. Loki pulls his cloak tighter and thinks, not about glory or heroism, but about timing and feathers, and how to move through danger in such a quiet way that even the danger gets bored and looks somewhere else. He knows he will need a borrowed shape. And the story is told later. This part becomes dramatic. A falcon suit, swift wings, daring flights through narrow gaps in the clouds. But standing alone on a rocky outcrop with the wind tugging at his hair, Loki mostly thinks about the practicalities. Transforming is work. Wings mean new muscles that will complain, feathers that must be kept in order, a different way of seeing the world where every gust of wind is suddenly a very opinionated suggestion. He reviews his options the way another person might go through a closet before a trip. Falcon form is useful for speed. Salmon form is good for rivers and for slipping through fingers that try to grab you. Fly form is excellent for eavesdropping, but terrible for dignity. After a moment of uncharacteristic maturity, he chooses the falcon suit. If he has to carry Idunn somehow, it will help to have more wings and fewer fins. Back in Asgard, the suit is kept folded in a safe place, almost like travel luggage that only a few people are allowed to borrow. Loki has used it before, usually with very little permission and even less explanation afterwards. This time, he asks Freya for it directly. The goddess of love and beauty looks at him for a long, silent moment, as if checking whether the request is another one of his elaborate jokes. His shoulders are a little slumped, his usual crook grin resting somewhere far away. Eventually she nods, retrieves the cloak of feathers, and drapes it across his arms with a gesture that feels very much like handing someone both a tool and a test. "Do bring it back," she says calmly, and Loki can't tell whether she means the cloak or the goddess of apples, or both. Either way, he promises. Somewhere in the middle of all this, he remembers to mention, very casually, That if the rescue works and you happen to still be awake later, you could always subscribe to more of these quiet disasters. If not, that is fine too. Sleep is the strictest god of all. Wearing borrowed feathers is a peculiar sensation. As Loki wraps the cloak around himself, the world seems to tilt. His arms stretch and thin into wings, his fingers turning to primary feathers that catch the breeze with opinions of their own. His bones feel lighter, hollow in a way that is not fragility but design. He takes a few experimental flaps, then more confident ones, until leaving the ground feels as natural as taking a step. From above, Asgard shrinks into a cluster of bright roofs and shimmering halls, suddenly small enough to fit into a story rather than the other way around. The flight toward the land of the giants is not a dramatic chase. It is a long commute. Loki follows winds that know where they are going, riding currents the way a very experienced passenger might lean into the subtle movements of a familiar train. Below him, the landscape changes in unhurried layers. Green fields giving way to darker forests, forests thinning into bare rock and crooked trees, then finally into the harsher lines of Jotunheim, the giant's domain. Here, cliffs stand up straight like people who have just been reminded of their responsibilities, and the air tastes colder, as if the weather has opinions about visitors. As he flies, Loki keeps himself awake with small observations, because when you are responsible for the immortality of an entire pantheon, dozing off mid-flight is generally discouraged. He counts the shadows of mountain peaks sliding slowly across the ground. He notes how the rivers twist differently here, more like question marks than exclamation points, as if the land itself is skeptical. He even amuses himself by imagining what Idunn might say if she could see him now. Perhaps something about how even a god of mischief can look dependable from far enough away. The thought makes him flap a little more steadily. Eventually, he reaches the valley where Chazi keeps his hall. It is not a cheerful place, but it is not theatrically gloomy either. The walls are high, the doors heavy, the windows narrow. It is the architectural equivalent of someone who does not trust easily and also dislikes drafts. Loki circles above, feathered body resting on the wind, and takes stock. There's smoke from the hearth, a few wandering giants outside moving with the unhurried weight of people who are large enough not to rush. A group of ravens perches on a nearby rock, eyeing the hall in a professional way, as if they are always ready for news. Loki wonders briefly if they recognize him. Then he remembers that in this form, he is just another bird with slightly anxious wing beats. Inside, Idunn is waiting in a way that is not entirely patient. She has been given a room, which is something, and a place to set down her basket, which is something else. The apples sit in their woven nest, shining faintly even in the dim light, as if they enjoy being contrary to their surroundings. Chazi, who considers himself a generous host despite having kidnapped his guest, has probably said something about comfort and safety and a better view of the world outside Asgard. Idunn, who has more sense than her soft appearance suggests, has noticed that the door to her room locks from the outside. She passes the time by checking each apple for bruises and imagining the number of ways she will rearrange Loki's schedule when she returns. When he finally slips into the hall, disguised as a small creature scurrying along the shadows, Idunn recognizes him almost immediately. Tricksters have a way of carrying their personality with them, no matter what they look like. Maybe it is the tilt of his head. Maybe it is the particular style of cautious swagger. Whatever it is, she narrows her eyes and says, in the calm, even tone of someone who has had a long time to rehearse this moment, "You are late." Loki, returning to his normal form in the quiet corner of her room, gives a half bow that is more apology than flourish. "Traffic," he says. "Too many mountains. Not enough shortcuts." It is a poor joke, but Idunn's mouth twitches despite herself. Annoyance and relief are standing very close together in her expression. He explains the plan in low, steady words. They will leave in borrowed shapes. She will become a nut or a small bird shapes vary in different tellings, and he will carry her and the apples back to Asgard in falcon form. Chassi, once he realizes his prize guest has gone, will certainly follow, which means they must combine speed with subtlety. Still, the plan is simple as plans go: transform, escape, fly. It sounds almost restful when Loki describes it, like the mythic version of catching the last bus home. Turning Idunn into something portable is the easy part. She is cooperative, which helps, and she has spent enough time around magic fruit that the idea of becoming briefly fruit adjacent does not frighten her. The harder task is convincing the apples themselves to behave. They have been sitting in this giant's hall long enough to develop opinions. Loki gathers them into the basket, feeling their stubborn weight, and whispers small reassurances under his breath. Back to Asgard, he murmurs, as if talking to a herd of tired animals. Back to routine. Back to shelves and careful hands. If apples can be soothed, these ones are. The escape itself happens not with a crash, but with a series of small, well-timed motions. Loki wraps the falcon cloak around his shoulders, feeling wings unfurl where arms used to be. Idunn, now reduced to something small enough to fit in his talons or be tucked against his body, waits without complaint. The basket, shrunken by magic, hangs lightly from his grasp. He nudges the window open with his beak, not too fast, not too slow, and slips out into the cold air like a thought leaving an overcrowded room. For a few heartbeats, the world is nothing but wind and momentum. Loki climbs higher, joining a current that carries him away from the hall and its heavy stone presence. Behind him, there is the faint sound of giants realizing something is wrong. A door opening, a shouted name, the thud of large feet moving more quickly than they usually bother to. Chassi's eagle form launches into the sky, powerful wings beating the air. In a more dramatic version of this story, what follows would be a fierce chase, full of near misses and thrilling dives. In Loki's current mood, it is more like being gently but persistently followed by a very large, very annoyed bird. He focuses on the rhythm of flight: beat, glide, adjust. Beat, glide, adjust. The basket of apples bumps lightly against his chest in time with his wing strokes, like a second heartbeat. Idunn's small enchanted form rests near his side, silent but steady. Loki keeps his attention on the path ahead, tracing a line in his mind from this cold sky back to the familiar outline of Asgard as walls. Every so often, he glances back to gauge the distance. Chassi is there, a dark shape against the paler clouds, always moving, never quite catching up. It is less like being hunted and more like being reminded, repeatedly, that procrastination is flying behind you with talons. As they approach Asgard, the air seems to lighten, not in color exactly, but in attitude. The winds here have carried gods and their habits for a very long time. They know the curves of the walls, the taste of the river, the smell of the golden hall's smoke. Loki feels them recognize him, or at least the cloak he wears, and shift just enough to help. Up ahead, the watchful eyes of Heimdall catch the movement in the sky. He says nothing at first. He merely adjusts his stance on the rainbow bridge, as if readying himself to witness whatever is about to happen, with the thoroughness of someone whose job description includes seeing almost everything. The return is, in its own way, almost anticlimactic. Loki crosses into the familiar air above Asgard, and the giants, bound by older rules and older grudges, find their pursuit slowed. Chassi presses closer, wings beating harder, but the distance between them never quite closes. In this quieter telling, the defenses are mostly atmospheric. The sky itself seems to disapprove of further intrusion. The currents twist in subtle ways that make it increasingly inconvenient for a giant to keep up, like a series of small social cues hinting that a guest has overstayed their welcome. Eventually, the pursuing shape falls back, more from discomfort than from defeat. and Loki glides the last stretch with a cautious, unbelieving relief. He lands inside the safety of the walls, talons touching down on familiar stone, and lets the transformation loosen. Wings fold into arms, feathers sink back into fabric, air becomes heavier in his lungs. He stands there for a moment, still catching up to his own solidity, then gently sets down the enchanted form of Idunn and the basket of apples. The magic unwinds in a soft shimmer. Idunn straightens into herself again, hair falling around her shoulders, expression composed, but with a flicker of emotion in her eyes that might be gratitude, or exhaustion, or the deep irritation of someone whose routine has been forcibly interrupted. Around them, the gods gather, not rushing, but converging with the inevitability of people who have been waiting too long for a delayed delivery. Their faces brighten almost at once, as if the mere sight of the apples is enough to smooth out some of the new lines that time has drawn. No one cheers loudly. They simply breathe a little deeper. The hall, which had felt stretched thin, starts to plump back into its usual mythic fullness. Someone makes a dry comment about Loki's timing. Someone else remarks that next time they misplace the key to eternal youth, they might consider not sending the god of bad ideas to escort it outside the walls. The jokes are gentle, but they land, and Loki accepts them like sighs. Idunn moves through the group with her basket, offering each god an apple with the unhurried efficiency of someone returning to a familiar chore. One by one, they take a bite, and the change is immediate, but not flashy. It is in the way their eyes clear, the way the stiffness drains from their limbs, the way the air around them seems to remember that it is supposed to shimmer a little more. Watching this, Loki feels something he doesn't often admit to: satisfaction. Not the sharp, private satisfaction of a successful prank, but a quieter, more public contentment. He did something difficult, and for once, the benefit is shared evenly across the table. There will be conversations later, of course. Odin will want a thorough explanation. Idunn will have questions, especially about the sales pitch that persuaded her to leave Asgard in the first place. There may even be rules written down somewhere about who is and is not allowed to borrow the goddess of youth for field trips. But those moments can wait. For now, there's just the crunch of apples, the gentle hum of voices, and the gradual, almost invisible restoration of immortality as a daily habit, rather than a thrilling privilege. Loki, feeling the eyes on him soften by a few degrees, slips toward the edge of the gathering. He is not quite ready for gratitude. It makes him itchy. Still, before he goes, he catches Idunn's gaze. She holds it for a heartbeat, then inclines her head in a small nod that says, clearly enough, we will talk later, but also, for now, thank you. It is more forgiveness than he reasonably expected. He nods back, awkward and a little surprised, then retreats to a quieter corner where he can listen to the repetitive sounds of a hall, returning to its usual version of eternity. Somewhere high above, the sky continues its slow turning. The crisis that might have been a saga of catastrophe has turned under careful handling, and a great deal of flying into something more like a reminder about the importance of not tampering with the supply chain of immortality. The gods, once again young in their own ageless way, resume the endless cycle of feasts and sleepy evenings. Loki still has his habits, his tricks, his restless mind, but for the moment, all of that is wrapped in a feather cloak hanging neatly in its proper place, waiting for the next time he needs to become something other than what he seems. And as the hall settles into its familiar rhythm, you're invited to do the same. Let your thoughts glide the way Loki's wings did on the long flight home, rising and falling in easy patterns that don't demand decisions. Imagine the soft crunch of apples down the table, the quiet laughter of gods whose joints no longer ache, the low murmur of conversations that no longer travel in urgent circles. There's nothing you need to fix tonight, no baskets to recover, no giants to outfly. There's only the slow return of comfort, the gentle settling of time back into its usual shape, and the simple task of letting your own breathing smooth out like a falcon folding its wings at last and closing its eyes in the safe, familiar dusk. You might not expect this story about eternal youth to sound so much like a bedtime routine, but that is what it becomes in Asgard after the day the gods almost grew old for good. The crisis has passed in the loudest sense. There are no giants at the gates, no feathers falling from the sky, no frantic meetings under the high rafters. Instead, there is something very quiet and very serious happening around a woven basket on a long wooden table. The apples are back where they belong. They shine in the lamplight with a peculiar glow of things that have opinions about time. Each one looks ordinary, almost like the kind you might see in a market, but if you stare too long at their skin, you get the mild impression that they are staring back, calmly taking notes on your wrinkles. The hall smells of smoke and roasted meat and fresh-cut wood. It always does, but tonight the air also has the crisp, faintly sweet scent of the apples themselves. You could imagine it, if you like, something between autumn and spring, a fragrance that cannot decide whether it has just fallen from the tree or is about to bloom again. The gods file in slowly, not because they are still weak, but because they have learned, for the briefest of moments, to be careful. Earlier, they felt their joints protest and their shoulders sink. Now, standing in front of the basket, they remember that sensation with the same uneasy respect you might feel for a staircase you once tripped on. No one wants to rush this. Idunn stands beside her apples like a librarian reunited with a lost collection. She smooths the cloth lining the basket, checks each piece of fruit again, and says almost nothing. She does not need to announce that the ritual is beginning. The gods already know the steps. They have done this countless times, so often that they merely forgot it was a privilege and not a background process. One by one, they come forward. Odin first, although he does not say that he is first. He simply happens to be standing closest, in the way leaders often are when something important arrives. He chooses an apple with long, calloused fingers, weighing it as though measuring not just its size, but its years. When he bites into it, the sound echoes softly through the hall, a quiet crunch that every ear is tuned to hear. It is not a dramatic transformation. There's no flash of light, no thunderclap, no swirling of runes. Instead, the change unfolds the way warmth spreads through a room after someone shuts a drafty window. The lines at the corners of his remaining eye ease a little, his shoulders straighten by a small, almost impolite amount. Somewhere in his bones, the ache of too many decisions loosens. Watching this, the others relax like people who have just seen the result of a very important product review. The apples still work. They come forward in pairs and clusters. Frigg follows, then Thor, eager but trying not to appear too eager, as if biting into an apple too quickly might look undignified for the god of thunder. He chooses the largest one, of course. That was never in question. When his teeth sink in, the relief is almost visible, like a cloud lifting from his face. He flexes his fingers experimentally, and you can almost hear his thoughts. The hammer will feel right again. On the benches, the younger gods and goddesses exchange small looks, a kind that say, we might have laughed if the joke had not been on all of us. Even the goddesses of beauty and love examine the backs of their hands, as if afraid to find a hint of the future written in fine lines. Loki is there too, standing slightly apart from the main flow, as though he is both part of the circle and somehow watching it from outside. He has already had his apple. He took a quick bite as soon as Idunn allowed it, partly because he needed the strength and partly because, well, if you have recently been blamed for almost causing universal retirement, you do not turn down the renewal plan. Now he leans against a pillar, listening to the soft murmur of voices, the hush that falls each time another bite is taken. If you listen closely, you can almost hear his thoughts wandering around the edges of the moment, already touching on future schemes, but tonight even his mischief is wrapped in a thin blanket of gratitude. It is very hard to plot chaos when your bones remember, in the back of their memory, how it felt to be heavy. There is no formal speech to mark the end of the ritual. The gods are not in the mood for grand declarations. Instead, when the basket is lightened and everyone feels the quiet return of their agelessness, a different kind of conversation begins. It is softer, more practical, and very similar to the sort of talk you might hear in a household that has just narrowly avoided a disaster with the heating system. They discuss safeguards, they talk about schedules, they murmur about boundaries that should have been there all along. Odin suggests, in a tone that tries to sound casual, that perhaps it is time to make written rules about who is allowed to escort Idunn outside the walls. Frigg agrees, adding that no unsupervised outings with tricksters should probably be more than a suggestion. Idunn listens without interrupting. She is not interested in punishment. She is interested in patterns. Her power has always been about repetition, the daily, weekly, unremarkable act of taking an apple, biting, swallowing, and continuing with the day. She knows that immortality is less a dramatic gift and more a habit you maintain. So when she speaks, it is not to demand vengeance or gratitude. It is to propose something very simple, more attention, more awareness of the little ritual that keeps everything running. We can pretend, she says quietly, that the apples are just there, like the roof and the floor, but they are not. They are a choice we keep making. We should at least notice when we make it. This is not the sort of statement that would make a good heroic poem, but in the hush of the hall, it lands with unexpected weight. The gods shift on their benches. They think of all the small things they do without really seeing them. Sharpening weapons, mending clothes, feeding ravens, checking the locks on the doors each night. The apples used to feel like part of the furniture, the way the sunrise feels like part of the sky. Now, after almost losing them, the gods begin to understand that each bite is a quiet oath. I choose to stay. I choose to continue. I choose to be part of this ongoing story for one more day. Some of them are comforted by this thought. Others find it faintly unsettling, like realizing that every morning coffee you have ever drunk was actually a contract. The apples have always been her responsibility, but tonight, responsibility stretches out like a tablecloth and covers the whole hall. It is shared now, whether the gods like it or not. Later, when the feasting has quieted and only a few embers still glow in the central hearth, Odin asks Idunn to walk with him along the outer wall. The night is clear, the stars bright and indifferent, hanging above Asgard like glittering reminders that even gods are small against some kinds of time. Their footsteps echo softly on the stone path. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, watch from a nearby parapet, their dark feathers ruffled against the cold. They have flown across the worlds, seen wars and prophecies and countless arguments. But even they noticed how quickly panic arrived when the apples vanished. Odin speaks of foresight, of plans layered on plans, of how he tries to see the shape of what is coming. Idunn listens politely, then answers in the steady rhythm of someone who plants trees rather than reading omens. You look far, she says, and that is good. But someone also has to look closely. The apples do not care about prophecy. They care about being kept, counted, and shared at the right time. She pauses, then adds, with a tone so mild it almost hides the rebuke, perhaps next time you could foresee a schedule. They both know there will be a next time of something. There always is. Ragnarok waits somewhere in the deep future, like a storm cloud that is too far away to ruin today as laundry, but close enough to show up in the long-range forecast. Between now and then, there will be other crises, other mishaps, other days when Loki's curiosity outruns his judgment. But tonight, standing on the wall with the cold air stroking their faces, Odin and Idunn agree on one small, practical measure. The apples will be guarded more carefully, not with drama, but with routine. Extra eyes at the gate, clearer permissions. A quiet understanding that if Idunn ever leaves Asgard again, everyone will know where she is going, with whom, and why. Back inside, Loki sits alone for a moment near the now quiet table. He rolls the core of his apple between his fingers, watching the tiny arc of its shadow in the firelight. He did not intend for things to go so wrong. His mischief usually stays within manageable boundaries, a swapped seat here, a misplaced object there, a comment that causes a small argument but not a cosmic crisis. This time, his easy agreement to Chassie's offer nearly turned the whole structure of Asgard into a waiting room for old age. The thought makes him uncomfortable in ways that no ordinary scolding ever has. He dislikes feeling responsible for anything that doesn't also make him laugh. He considers making a vow out loud, something dramatic about never again endangering the apples. It would sound good, and some poets might approve. But Loki knows himself too well. He understands that his nature curls around promises like smoke around beams. Instead, he chooses something smaller and more realistic. A personal rule that he will at least ask one more question next time someone offers him a suspiciously generous deal. It is not much. It is, however, how habits start. One more question, one more moment to think. One more chance for better mischief and fewer emergencies. As the night deepens, a kind of informal oath spreads among the gods, though no one stands up to announce it. Thor, cleaning imaginary dust from the handle of his hammer, resolves to pay more attention to how often he drops by Idunn's table, simply out of habit. Frigg, weaving thoughts about the future, quietly integrates the apples into her long threads, marking them as points that must be kept safe. The younger gods, still rattled by the feeling of sore joints and tired eyes, privately agree never to take the ritual for granted again, at least not for a while. It is very much like the way people, after a temporary power outage, swear they will always keep extra candles until a few calm months go by and the drawer fills up with other things. In time, the hall empties. Idunn returns the remaining apples to their more private resting place, somewhere cool and dark, where light only reaches them when it is invited. She counts them once more, fingers brushing each smooth curve, lips moving silently as if reciting a familiar prayer without any gods listening but herself. Satisfied, she closes the lid and fastens the simple clasp. There's no enchantment locking it, no thunderous seal. Just a latch and the knowledge that everyone now understands how important that small click is. The oath of borrowed time is not carved into stone or sung before a battle. It exists in softer ways, in the memory of aching joints that no longer ache in the way eyes linger a moment longer on the basket when it is carried into the hall, and the new habit of asking where Idunn is before anyone starts a meeting that might last until twilight. It lives in the quiet understanding that their immortality, while impressive on a cosmic resume, is still something that needs maintenance, like a roof, or a friendship, or a very complicated piece of furniture from another world that came with no instruction manual. And as the gods drift off to their chambers, the night settles around Asgard with the even, steady calm of a story that refuses to end with a trumpet. There are still stars above, still ravens somewhere in the dark, still apples resting in their basket, breathing in their slow, almost imperceptible way. Idunn sleeps lightly, as keepers often do, ears tuned for the smallest disturbance. Loki sleeps eventually, dreams full of feathers and keys and one extremely judgmental apple. The rest of the gods sleep as beings who have been reminded, gently but firmly, that even endless life is something you can almost misplace. You, listening from wherever you are, do not need a basket of golden apples to borrow a little more time for yourself tonight. All you need is the small, repeated ritual of closing your eyes, letting your thoughts wander like slow ravens over familiar roofs, and choosing again and again to stay here in this soft moment instead of chasing after distant storms. If you are still awake in a little while, you can come back to Asgard and watch the apples being counted one more time. If not, that is perfectly fine. The story will keep turning without you for a bit, like the sky above the hall, patient and unbothered, while you drift quietly into your own, very mortal, very necessary sleep.